Here's the introduction for your YouTube video story. I never thought a single moment in college would change my entire outlook on life. But that's exactly what happened one afternoon when my professor walked in on me crying. I wasn't just shedding a few tears. I was completely breaking down, the kind of silent, painful sobbing that you hope no one ever sees. I had buried my face in my hands. My chest felt tight, and no matter how hard I tried to breathe through it, the weight of everything was just too much. It had been one of those weeks where everything went wrong. I had bombed an exam I'd studied so hard for. An important project was due in just a few days, and to top it all off, I was struggling with some personal issues I didn't even know how to talk about. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. So I did the only thing I could think of. I found an empty classroom, sat in the farthest corner, and let everything spill out. I thought I was alone. But then, out of nowhere, I heard the door creak open. My heart stopped. I quickly wiped my face and kept my head down, hoping whoever it was would just leave. But they didn't. I heard slow, careful footsteps coming closer, and then a voice, calm, steady, and familiar. It was my professor. He wasn't one of those strict, intimidating types. In fact, he was the kind of teacher who actually cared, the kind who remembered your name even in a class of 100 students. But at that moment, I didn't care who he was. I just wanted him to walk away so I could pull myself together in peace. But he didn't walk away. Instead, he did something I never expected. He sat down next to me. For a moment, he didn't say anything. No awkward small talk, no immediate questions. Just silence, a comforting, unspoken understanding. And then, in the gentlest voice, he finally spoke. And what he said next changed everything. He didn't ask me what was wrong. He didn't pressure me to talk. He just sat there, letting the silence settle between us, as if he understood that sometimes words weren't the first thing someone needed. That alone caught me off guard. Most people, when they see someone crying, either ignore it or rush to fill the space with meaningless reassurance. But he didn't do that. Instead, after a moment, he simply said, "You know, I've sat in this same spot before, feeling like the world was caving in on me." I blinked, caught off guard. I wasn't expecting that. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I noticed the exhaustion behind his usual calm demeanor. The way his shoulders carried a weight I had never paid attention to before. Professors always seemed like they had everything figured out, like they had already crossed the finish line we were all still running toward. But in that moment, he wasn't just my professor, he was a person, someone who had been through something. He leaned back slightly, his gaze distant, as if he were remembering something from a long time ago. "I don't know what's on your mind," he continued, his voice steady but soft. "But I do know what it's like to feel like you're drowning and no one notices. To feel like no matter how hard you try, it's never enough." Those words hit me harder than I expected, because that's exactly how I felt. Like I was sinking, like I was failing, like I was completely alone in a sea of expectations I couldn't meet. My chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't just from sadness. It was from the sudden realization that someone, somehow, understood. For a second, I considered brushing it off, telling him I was fine, like I always did. But something in the way he looked at me, patient and knowing, made me hesitate. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity, just quiet understanding. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the smallest urge to actually say something. But before I could open my mouth, he spoke again. And what he said next made my breath catch in my throat. "I used to think that struggling meant I wasn't good enough," he said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "That if I was feeling lost, it meant I was failing. But I was wrong." I swallowed hard. His words felt too close, too real. because that's exactly how I had been feeling, like I wasn't enough, like no matter how much effort I put in, I was still falling short. I had always been the kind of person who pushed through, who pretended everything was fine even when it wasn't. But sitting there, with my professor looking at me like he saw straight through me, I couldn't pretend anymore. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I had a moment like this in my own life, he continued, years ago, in graduate school. I had convinced myself I wasn't smart enough to be there. I was overworked, overwhelmed, and I thought, maybe I just wasn't meant to make it. His voice dropped slightly, the weight of his confession filling the room. But then someone told me something that changed everything. I held my breath, waiting. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and said, "You don't have to be perfect to be worthy. You don't have to have all the answers today. Struggling doesn't mean you're failing. It just means you're trying." My throat tightened. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But I had spent so long carrying the fear of not being enough that I didn't know how to let it go. And the worst part? A voice in the back of my head was still whispering that maybe, just maybe, he was wrong. For a few seconds, I couldn't say anything. His words lingered in the air between us, pressing against everything I had been feeling. I wanted to believe him, but part of me still resisted. What if struggling wasn't just part of the process? What if I really wasn't good enough? I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. The weight in my chest wasn't lifting. If anything, it felt heavier. I clenched my hands into fists, trying to steady myself, but my professor noticed. "You don't believe me, do you?" he asked, not unkindly. I hesitated, then shook my head. "I don't know," I admitted. My voice was barely above a whisper. "What if I never figure things out? What if I keep trying and I still fail?" He exhaled slowly, leaning forward just slightly. "Then you keep going," he said, "because giving up guarantees failure. Pushing through gives you a chance." I let his words sink in, but doubt still tugged at me. What if I don't have it in me? His eyes softened. "You wouldn't be here right now if you didn't." That hit something deep inside me. I had been so consumed by everything going wrong, my grades, my exhaustion, my personal struggles, that I hadn't even considered the fact that I was still here. I was still trying. I was still showing up, even when it felt impossible. But just as that thought started to take hold, something else pushed back against it. That voice in my head, the one that always told me I wasn't enough, grew louder. What if I was just fooling myself? What if all of this was just temporary reassurance, and soon I'd be back to feeling like I was drowning again? I bit my lip, staring down at my hands. I could feel the tension rising, the battle in my mind getting stronger. My professor was waiting, giving me space to process, but deep down, I knew he was leading up to something. And then, just as the silence started to feel unbearable, he took a deep breath and said something that made my entire world stop. "I know what it feels like to believe you're not enough," my professor said, his voice quieter now, more serious. "But what if I told you? I almost walked away from everything because of that same feeling." I looked up sharply. Something in his tone had shifted. This wasn't just another encouraging speech. This was personal. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "There was a time I convinced myself I wasn't meant to be here," he continued, "not just in school, but in life." My breath caught. The weight of his words settled between us, heavy and unshakable. I hadn't expected this. He had always seemed so in control, so sure of himself. The idea that he had felt this way, maybe even worse, sent a chill down my spine. "I reached a point where I thought I had failed too much to recover," he admitted, One night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at my books, my notes, everything I had worked for, and I thought, maybe this isn't worth it. Maybe I'm not worth it. He paused, his fingers laced together tightly, and I almost made a choice that I couldn't take back. I swallowed hard. I knew exactly what he meant, but something stopped me, he said, looking at me now, his eyes steady. A professor, someone who saw me when I thought I was invisible, told me the same thing I'm telling you now. That pain doesn't mean you're failing. It means you're alive, and as long as you're alive, you have a chance to turn things around. I felt my hands shaking. His words were cutting through every doubt, every fear I had buried deep. But before I could say anything, the door suddenly creaked open again. Someone else had just walked in, and when I turned to see who it was, my stomach dropped. Because it wasn't just anyone. It was the one person I had been avoiding, someone who had no idea what I was going through. And now there was no way to hide it. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as I looked up, and my worst fear was staring right back at me. It was her, the one person I had been avoiding, the one person I didn't want to see me like this. She stepped inside hesitantly, her eyes flickering between me and my professor. At first, she looked confused. Then her expression changed, softening in a way that made my chest tighten even more. She knew. Somehow, just by looking at me, she knew I wasn't okay. I wanted to run. I wanted to disappear. But my professor didn't move, and something about his presence kept me from bolting. He stayed right beside me, steady, as if silently telling me it was okay. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then she spoke. "I've been looking for you," she said gently. "Are you okay?" The question hit me harder than I expected. No one had asked me that, not in a way that really mattered. My instinct was to brush it off, to say I was fine. But after everything my professor had just told me, after everything that had happened, I couldn't lie. Not anymore. I exhaled shakily. "No," I admitted. "I'm not." Her face softened, and she took a step closer. "Then let me be here for you." I didn't know what to say. For so long, I had convinced myself that I had to go through this alone, that no one would understand. But in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't alone. I never had been. And just as I was about to respond, my professor spoke one last time. "You see," he said quietly, "you were never invisible." I sat there, my professor's words hanging in the air, wrapping around me like something I had been needing to hear for a long time. You were never invisible. I had spent so much time believing no one saw me, that no one would care, even if they did. But now, here they were, two people who did see me, who weren't looking away, who weren't letting me drown in silence. Something inside me cracked open. Not in a painful way, but in a way that felt like light finally breaking through after a long storm. I wasn't okay yet. I wasn't magically healed. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel completely lost. My professor gave me a small nod, as if he knew his work here was done. Then, without making a big deal out of it, he stood up and walked to the door. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Before he left, though, he paused just long enough to meet my eyes, one last time. And in that silent exchange, I understood. He had been where I was, and he had made it through. That meant I could too. I turned back to her. She was still standing there, waiting, patient and steady. And for once, I didn't push her away. "Can we just walk for a bit?" I asked, my voice unsteady but real. She smiled. "Of course." And as we stepped out into the hallway together, I realized something. The weight I had been carrying for so long, it wasn't gone, but it felt just a little bit lighter, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep going.